First of all, I want to say I'm sorry for having to do this presentation in English. Although I'm taking French lessons, my French is not good enough to make a proper presentation. So it will have to be in English. My name is Mario. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and a temporary lecturer at the Institute of Psychology of the State University of Rio de Janeiro. It's actually the State University, not the federal. I saw that there was some mistaken in the stuff about the presentation. So what I'm going to do now today is present part of my postdoctoral research. This is actually an article that is about to be finished in the next weeks, I hope. That is, its name is Suicide, Rape, and Family: Tracking Necropolitics in the Life of Brazilian LGBTQIA plus youth. Actually, this is the how we are using it nowadays in Brazil. It's without these letters. I know that here in Canada, it's common to use 2S as well because of two-spirit, but it's a really indigenous thing. That's not something that happens in Brazil as well. We have other trans identities, but they are all together in the T. Before going to the I don't know why I'm not being able to go forward. Oh, here. I would like to present some of the backgrounds of my research. This research was proposed in the context of the rise of the extreme right wing in Brazil, based on anti-LGBTQIA plus politics. In 2018, Bolsonaro was elected president. And in his first speech after the election result, was announced, he said that the minorities must bend to the majority. And on that day, a trans woman was beaten up on the street by Bolsonaro supporters, who kept screaming, "Now it's Bolsonaro." On January the 1st, when the Bolsonaro started his government, 2019, Damares Alves, that was the Ministry of Family, Women, and Human Rights, said it came a new area in Brazil. Boys now wear blue, girls wear pink. These are real sentences from these people in the government. So in 2018, I was a temporary lecturer at the Center of Public Policies on Human Rights of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where I lectured on LGBTQIA plus human rights. And in the week after the election, none of my students showed up. So this was the first thing that made me realize that something was going really wrong, relating emotions, mental health, and global politics in the country. So none of the students showed up, and in the following week, they told me that they had anxiety crisis, fearing going out on the street and being beaten up. So a colleague and this colleague is also a psychologist, a trans woman. By that time, she was a PhD candidate at the same university. So we proposed what we call the listening coterie, over after-election ethical political suffering. So based on previous experience with clinical political approaches with victims of state violence and forced migration, we proposed this coterie. So most of the people that attended to it were other professors and health professionals. They all trying to get some idea of how to deal with mental psychological distress after the election, the results of the elections. So this was the first experience that inspired the project that was proposed on the beginning of 2019, and it was approved in the middle of the year. The fellowship started in October 2019. And the name of the research, the title of the research is Psychological Suffering of LGBTI plus People in Contemporary Brazilian Scenario. It's an action research. So we conduct group psychotherapy influenced by the institutional analysis of Felix Guattari. I'm not going to talk about methodology of group therapy. That's not the idea here, but just for you to know what are the basic aspects of the research. So it was approved by the Research Ethics Committee, and all subjects have given informed consent. The research is still sponsored by FAPERJ, that's the State Foundation for Research Support in Rio de Janeiro. And the only inclusion criteria is the self-identification as an LGBTQIA plus person. So we have weekly meetings of 1.5 hours since March 2020. The project started in 2019, but the therapeutic groups started in March 2020. And we had just one face-to-face meeting. Then the university was closed because of the pandemics, and we had online meetings for almost 2 years. So that just for you get an idea of what is the project. The project in Portuguese is called Projeto Vozes e cores. It will be something like Voices and Colors project. We are on Facebook and Instagram, and people get in touch with us through social media. Then they just need to show up. We have no exclusion criteria based on absence. So people may come for a meeting and show up 2-3 months later, stay for a month or two, stop coming and come again. So this was an idea of creating a space that could be comfortable for people to come and go whenever they want. This was also part of the experimentation of the project in terms of methodology to work with groups in terms of psychotherapy. So this is an overall profile, sociological profile of the participants. So the majority are young people, 65% between 18 and 29 years old. Most of them university students. In terms of race and color, it's basically the same distribution of the Brazilian population. So 51% of Black people, 44 white, almost 3% indigenous, and 2% others. And 50% live with the original family. So I'm putting this because this is an idea that most of the problems that people brought to the meetings of the psychotherapy group were related to family issues, basically because most of the people live with their original families. In terms of gender identity, 41% cisgender men, 31% cisgender women, 8.8% transgender men, 6.8% non-binary people, and transgender woman, almost 7%. This, in terms of gender identity, this is a portrait of university students. The higher number of non-binary people in relation to transgender women in Brazil, it's a sign of who has access to the university. So most of transgender women in Brazil, they are expelled from home early, they are undereducated, and they don't have proper access to studying in the university. In terms of sexual orientation, 38% gay men, 22% lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, and other. And although there was a little percentage of asexual people, they were really they used to go to the meetings frequently. They weren't people that were absent most of the time. So one of the cases I'm going to bring here is based on the experience of one asexual woman. Asexual, a person who doesn't have a desire for sexual intercourse. Let's talk about suicide. And when we take into account the LGBTQIA plus suicide studies in Brazil, they showed that young people are 5 to 7 times more likely to engage in suicidal behavior. Well, young LGBTQIA plus people. If you take this comparison with Black people, or like the difference of Black and white people, Black people are 2 to 4 times more likely to engage in suicidal behavior than white people in Brazil. These 5 to 7 times, I have to specify that, for example, transgender men are 7 times more likely to engage in suicidal behavior than the rest of the population. And these 5% are related to gay men. So gay men are less likely to engage in suicidal behavior than transgender men. So there is a high underreporting rates of sexual orientation, gender identities in cases of suicidal behavior in the public health system. In the Brazilian public health system, there is a list of violences that it's compulsory, the notification is compulsory. And since suicidal behavior is considered a violence, a self-inflicted violence, it's one of those cases that the reporting is mandatory. Although the people who filling those reports, usually emergency rooms, most of the time they never ask about sexual orientation or gender identity. So if you take the files from the government, from the public health system, most of the time it's not filled in neither sexual orientation nor gender identity. So most of the data we have comes from NGOs reports. And according to some of these NGOs that report cases of violence against the community, there was an increase of 100% in LGBTQIA plus suicidal behavior between 2016 and 2017. And another increase of another 100% between 2018 and 2017 and 2018. Some people are arguing that there is a strict relation to the national politics in terms of who was running for president during that period. So in 2016 is when there was the parliamentary coup in Brazil, and Dilma Rousseff, that was the previous president, was taken out of power, and it was also the rise of Bolsonaro as a public voice of conservative politics, and their main target was the LGBTQIA plus community. Most of the politics and most of his arguments was against the community. There are more qualitative than quantitative research on LGBTQIA plus suicidal behavior. And those qualitative studies show that discrimination is the main reason for the suicidal behavior. There was a recent study that is more quantitative, and it also shows the same thing. It's suicidal behavior among LGBTQIA plus youth is higher than young people in general, significantly higher. So when we talk about suicidal behavior, we are talking not only about the suicide attempts, but the ideations, the planning, the attempts, and maybe the death in case of success in the attempt. So when we talk about suicidal behavior, this is common sense in suicidology, but since people here not everybody comes from suicide studies, so I want to present some of the basic concepts that we use to talk about suicide. Predisposing factors are those who predisposing factors are those factors that are part of the context where the people lives, the country, the economic factors, and so on. And according to most of the studies, homophobia and transphobia, as well as racism and religion, are the most important predisposing factors for suicidal behavior amongst LGBTQIA plus people. And religion, when we talk about Brazil, we're talking more specifically about evangelicals that promote promote conversion therapy for sex orientation and gender identity as well. So the intersectionality of these predisposing factors create an environment more likely for suicidal behavior. And when we talk about precipitating factors, we are talking about those key situations that precipitate the suicidal behavior. And when we take into account only AFAB, assigned female at birth people, rape is the most important precipitating factor. As in the second comes religious, family, and school harassment and online bullying. I'm putting rape here because my idea here is to present some cases where rape is the precipitating factor for suicidal behavior. So this is what I'm calling the micropolitics of rape and family. I will read a part of the clinical cases I'm bringing so I won't get lost. So we will start with what I call the stimulated rape. Samantha is a 20-year-old cisgender woman who identifies as a lesbian. At the first meeting she participates in, she asks, how can I be sure I'm a lesbian? Do you have any psychological evaluation for that? Samantha reports a deep sense of inner confusion about her sexuality. This confusion would be making it difficult for her to sleep, leading to episodes of anxiety and crying over apparently no reason. When asked about how this question arose, she tells about her relationship with her mother. So claiming to have a good relationship with her, Samantha says that during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemics, her mother began to question how she could be so sure of being a lesbian if she had never had sex with a man. Her mother's constant questioning had an effect on Samantha. She asks herself whether her lesbian identity is more the result of a habit than a certainty about her desire. After all, in her own words, how could I be sure that I don't like something I've never tasted? Having internalized this doubt, Samantha decides that she should try sexual intercourse with a man. And a short time later, an opportunity arises at a party with friends. A young man is chosen. She makes herself available for flirting, and they make out. Samantha says that this first moment was okay. She even thought she didn't feel a strong desire for this young man. There was also no uncomfortable feeling or disgust. At a later hour at the night, they go to one of the rooms in the house for sexual intercourse. At this point, amid these tears and sobs, Samantha says, I felt like I was being raped. It was horrible, but I wasn't being raped. I consented to everything. I decided to be there. So it wasn't rape. Even so, I had this feeling of being raped, but I couldn't say I was being raped. I said I wanted to, and he was my friend, but it was horrible. At this point, at the same meeting, Jessica, who is a 30-year-old cisgender woman who identifies as asexual, started talking. She has been in a romantic relationship with a man for some years. And by that time, she had already talked about 2 suicide attempts, and that she had never received the diagnosis of schizophrenia in the past. After 3 months of regularly participating in the meetings, Jessica manages to bring up the situation that triggered her first suicide attempt. At the meeting, very emotional after Samantha's statements, she says, I have already been raped, and with the help of my mother. Then she reports that many years ago, without specifying the exact date, in one of her first relationships, her mother insisted that she should have sex with her boyfriend because the absence of sexual desire is not normal, according to in her mother's words. Behind her back, her mother insists with her boyfriend that he should be more incisive and that if he forced it, she would eventually give in. One day, she leaves them alone at home with the front door locked and with permission and encouragement for her boyfriend to force a sexual intercourse with her daughter. All this is revealed to Jessica by her boyfriend after they broke up a couple of months later, and confirmed by her own mother, who claimed to have done it for love and wishing the best for her. A few months after this discovery, Jessica has her first hallucinations. So the schizophrenia came after the rape. So in this first hallucinations, a motherly image who suggests her to give up her pain, and she attempts suicide for the first time. The third case I want to present is what I call the rape avoided. Melissa is a 9-year-old cisgender woman who identifies herself as lesbian, living in the same house with her mother, grandmother, and younger sister, to whom she should be a moral example according to the family expectations. Not only the family expectations, but also her expectations as well. Both her mother and her grandmother argue that due to an all-female family configuration, Melissa would have learned to love only women, and that this would be more a matter of habit than the truth about herself. It is the same question. How could she be so sure about being a lesbian if she had never had sex with a man? Thus, Melissa starts considering the possibility of having a sexual experience with a man. She asks in the group, can psychology help me to know if I am in fact a lesbian? Because every time I think about sex with a man, I feel disgusted. I want to vomit, as if I was going to be raped. In Melissa's case, we choose to question the two family interpolations, the need for an experience that sustains a certainty about her sexual orientation, and the obligation and responsibility to be a moral example for her sister. Would such interpolations have the same distracting symbolic force if Melissa understood herself as heterosexual? Melissa gave up the idea of forcing herself in a sexual experience with a man, and the rape was avoided. I summarized here the case in order not to be so long in this part. So the three cases that we brought here explain the subtle and lethal path of family violence against LGBTQIA+ youth, in which rape is a special type of violence against assigned female at birth, AFAB people. The so-called corrective rape, that's actually what happens in the second case, in the case of Jessica, is characterized by the use of sexual violence as a tool in an attempt to correct an alleged deviation in the victim's sexual desire and or behavior, commonly against lesbian and trans people. The cases presented show new forms of this kind of violence. If in Jessica's case, the violence is committed in the name of motherly love and without the victim's consent, in Samantha's case, that was the first case I presented, the violence seems to proceed in a more cunning way, building a victimless scene in which the victim can only be the culprit. At first, all her certainties about her sexual orientation were removed. In a never-ending sexual hesitation, the victim becomes more receptive to suggestions, especially when coming from an important person, such as a mother. The induction of a sexual act, consented but not desired, is established by the relationship between Samantha and her mother. In other words, rape is a way of being a good daughter and meeting the expectations of a good mother. The result of this subjective operation is a violence whose culprit could only be the victim herself. Samantha was feeling guilt for not having enough certainty about her sexuality, or at least not enough to stand up the repeated suggestions of her mom. But according to her mother, this certainty could only be achieved by following such suggestions. There seems to be no way out of for Samantha outside of rape as a condition of certainty about her sexual orientation. That could not be properly classified as corrective rape because there is no corrective agent. There is not somebody trying to correct another person and forcing that person to have sex with him or her. It is more a certification rape that aims at an alleged certainty about the sexual identity of the victim who consents to an act without wanting it. As an effect of this certification, there is the production of a specific feeling of guilt in the midst of a broad picture of psychological disorganization. The presence of consent without desire is a hallmark of the process of internal disruption and the production of psychological suffering. Here it is not the same feeling of guilt that occurs in many victims of sexual violence when they hold on to the idea that they could have done something different that would prevent the rape and blame themselves for some action that may have facilitated or precipitated the rape itself. Like if I weren't wearing this skirt, if I didn't go to that party, if I didn't accept a drink, if I didn't go to walk it through that alley, that those common thoughts of guilt presented by victims of sexual violence. But that's not exactly the same case of Samantha. Samantha was not taken by surprise, but was induced to take the place of agent of her own violence. Here is the key to understanding the intensity of the damage that certification rape has on subjectivity. The approach of distant sexuality and gender expressions as something potentially transitory was already stated by Eve Sedgwick in her epistemology, the classical essay, Epistemology of the Closet. The characterization of such important elements of the subject's life, such as gender and sexuality, as transitory and unreal, has effects on a range of aspects of subjectivity. This seems to be one of the main tools for producing psychological suffering and illness in LGBTQIA+ youth by their families. These processes are in turn linked to suicidal behavior in terms of both predisposition and precipitation. So here, I would like to bring the concept of necropolitics. It wasn't the title of the presentation by qu'il and state the importance of proper translating it into a different context. I've been doing this based on some questioning of some colleagues, mostly Black women scholars, saying that when we take the concept of a white philosopher, we always demand from ourselves to explain it really accurate. And what has been happening during the past 10 years with Bembe's concept of necropolitics is being the usage of it as if it was self-evident and as if it didn't need further explanation. So since the concept of Bembe's based on Foucault's biopolitics was created in a historical, political, and territorial perspective of colonialism, and basically to talk about racism, state racism. So some transits and translations of this concept are necessary when we talk about a totally different context of family. So we're not talking about the state or something that we could consider 100% public, but more private. And to talk about something that's totally different from race, that's sexuality and gender expression. And is the difference between race and sexuality also stated by Eve Sedgwick at or epistemology of the closet, talks a lot about how family plays a totally different role in terms of racialized people. Then when they go back to their house, they at least may have a safe space to talk about the violence they suffer on the street, to learn how to deal with it, not only in terms of social response, but also in terms of psychological suffering. I know this is not all racialized families that that build this environment at home for this kind of conversation, but at least it's more common to have that at racialized families than other families when it takes to talk about homophobia, transphobia, or other kinds of violence against LGBTQIA plus people. So in this, in addition to different ways to managing, so coming back to necropolitics, what Bembe says is that in addition to different ways of managing life, there are different ways of managing death, and dying marked by territory and process of racialization. In this discussion, there is a polysemic function of suicide as a resistance, act of freedom, suicided subjects, and effects of necropolitics. This is not totally new. The social roots of suicide are stated in the classical work of Durkheim, as well as in the famous Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And also on more recent writings of Grada Quilombo. Except of Durkheim, all these other writers take into account racialized contexts. So if we take a discussion, produce it to contribute to race issues, to be useful for gender and sexuality debates, some adjustments are needed. And so far, the most important one is related to the different role that family regarding the support of family may give or not in case of racism and homotransphobia. So therefore, we remember Sedgwick, where she states that this different role. So if for racialized people, family may be a safe place, that's not the reality for LGBTQIA plus people. If we take an overlook of family studies regarding LGBTQIA plus community, most of these studies have a focus on families built by LGBTQIA plus people, the so-called rainbow families, or both, even in Portuguese and in French, the word of concept as homoparentalité, transparentalité. This also had a place in the classical book of Eribon, DJ Eribon, when he states that melancholy is a part of the gay life when gay people. He talks specifically about gay men in this book, but some things can be generalized to the whole community. So this idea of a melancholy in relation to the cis heterosexual way of life. So it's for a gender transitioning or even living openly gay or lesbian or bi, we give up all the privileges and all the expectations of family regarding a cis heterosexual way of life. Specifically in the case of Brazil, we must state that most of the studies regarding trans people, biographies, family is most of the times appear as this same history of exclusion and being expelled from home, having to find a way to survive, most of the time as sex workers and so on. So family here appears as the place of exclusion. In our first meeting of the psychotherapy group, there was a little discussion on family. One of the gay men participating in the group, he was on his late 30s, and due to being unemployed, he had to go back to his parents' place to live with them until he could get financially recovered. and he was talking about the difficulties of going back to his mother's place and not being able to bring in his boyfriend and not being able to have his boyfriend sleep overnight there. And then he said, "Oh, but it's okay. I have to accept that, Mom. You only have one." That's something that he said during the meeting. After he said that, much younger, around her 20s, trans woman was talking about the nightmare, in her words, that should be still living with her parents. And then she said that, "I know when he walks into the house by the sound of his steps, and I start to tremble." She was talking about her father, and she was talking about her constant anxiety crisis every time his father arrived home. So this is what I'm calling between cramps of recognition and everyday violence, that it depends on depending on a lot of intersectional factors. Family may be harder or less hard, but I could say that not being hard is the exception for most of LGBTQIA plus people. And of course, the context of the pandemics, there was increase in family violence, and that's not something specific for LGBTQIA plus people. It is also something regarding gender violence and violence against women. So what I'm trying to propose here is that family is a mechanism of necropolitics. So if you take into account Donzole's works when he writes about the substitution of family power in the public sphere, mainly in politics and economics, by the power over the private sphere. This is during the period during the 18th century, when most of the democracies were built in the Western world. That's the period that he talks about. In this compensatory process of power relations, notions such as privacy and intimacy are invented at the same time as they are placed under the tutelage of the family. In the sense, Donzolo proposes that the family would be a mechanism of government. If many young LGBTQIA plus people were suicided by their families, and if these are mechanisms of government over privacy and intimacy, we are inevitably in the field of politics, the governance of sexual and gender relations. If this policy puts two possible paths, correction or death, we are in the field of what Achille Mbembe calls necropolitics. So here, we are not talking about the lethal technology used by the state to deliberately kill mainly poor and Black people all over the world, but also about micromanagements of necropolitics in the life through gestures, word, and the so-called family values. Therefore, we can say that family kills, and that family kills cynically. This takes us, and that's something that I've been discussing with other colleagues in Brazil in the field of suicidology, people that work with other subjects like Black people suicides, mother suicides, and so on. So we are trying to make an exercise of rethinking suicide as a social violence. According to the World Health Organization, suicide is a self-inflicted violence. But what we've been seeing in our studies is that people were suicided. They may take the action of triggering a gun, jumping from a building, but what puts these people in the scene of taking the last action to take their lives away is a social structure, is a social violence. So so far we've never had any case of suicidal behavior in our project that we could say that it was a really self-inflicted violence, that were really something that could be considered totally individual and not social. So that's why we're saying about people are being suicidal. So it should be more of a cultural or social violence. Then this is part of my questions now. If this is only a reality in the global south, or if it's a reality only in underdeveloped or developing countries, where other kinds of social injustice are inevitably intersectional with gender and sexual issues. I don't know if this suicide as a self-inflicted violence, suicide as a totally individual problem, could be a reality only in developed countries where people don't have to worry about basic things for living, like food, housing, and not being killed by the police and so on. So if suicide were conceived as a form of social violence, what would be the consequences for prevention, crisis intervention, and postvention of suicide? Postvention, I don't know if everybody's know this concept is the psychological support, health support that you give both to a suicide survivor or the family of a person that died because of suicidal behavior. So what change would make? Because nowadays, out this both the mainstream speech about suicide prevention is totally medicalized. It's linked to the access of psychiatry support or antidepressives or other psychotropic drugs, and not a question of what seems to be the most important thing when we talk about suicide, is that a person must see a perspective of a world where she or he or they wants to live in. So a world one wants to live in should be the cornerstone of any policy of suicide prevention. So the whole of the political and social participation in mental health has been a great issue during all the project, and it was one of the things that we were asking ourselves about in the beginning of the research, as if what is the place of Bolsonaro's election, Ministry of Human Rights that says that boys were blue and girls were pink. So if all this has an effect in terms of suffering, psychological distress, anxiety crisis, and other elements of mental health, wouldn't the political and social issues be also a part of the cure or the treatment for or the promotion in mental health? And so that's part of a previous experience I had with immigrants and forced immigrants and refugees from war, that if the grieving is collective, if the grieving is social, the process of elaborating it social can also be collective or social. So sometimes the participation on a public protest, a riot, a strike, or whatever of way of having social participation is also a part of the treatment for a lot of mental health issues, of not being so distressed, of not being so depressive, as if there was no way out for a person. But if this person realized that this reality is shared with other people by different ways, because what happens to a gay white middle class man is not the same that happens to a black lesbian woman who lives in a favela in a really poor area in the suburbs. But there are some connections there that are possible to start to realize that the suffering that's connected to the suicidal behavior is not only happening to me, it can also be shared with other people, not sharing only my feelings, but sharing the feeling of injustice, sharing the feeling of a world where nobody wants to live in, and how can we have the idea that we are changing this and building a world where one wants to live in. And social participation and political participation has been a key way to think of it. That although this is probably a different study for the future, that would be regarding what we're going to say, what are the effects of political participation in terms of mental health for people that are engaged in minorities struggles in society, not only LGBTQIA+, but also people that are in anti-racist movements and so on. But that's a different talk for another day. And I think I kind of rushed, but I tried to make a presentation of less than an hour so we could have some time for talking. Thank you for your attention. This is my email. This is the email of the project, and also how you find us on social media.